Emma Watson opened her mailbox and found an HOA bill demanding $18,000 for her neighbor's new roof. James Cortland, the HOA chairman, had quietly rewritten the rules to benefit his rich buddy Harrington, while the rest of the neighborhood suffered under bogus fees. But Emma wasn't about to let these two crooks rob her or anyone else without a fight. And oh, you won't believe how she turned the tables and exposed their entire embezzlement scheme in front of everyone. Everything started on a deceptively peaceful morning with a letter in the mailbox. Emma Watson, no, not that Emma, spotted an HOA envelope tucked in between coupons and junk mail. Probably another reminder about lawn maintenance or driveway aesthetics, she thought, rolling her eyes. But when she ripped it open and read the contents, her stomach did a flip. Notice of assessment due, $18,000. Emma blinked, then read it again, slower this time, hoping the absurdity would disappear if she concentrated hard enough. Nope, still $18,000, and not for anything she requested or needed. No, this was for a new roof for her neighbor, Mr. Harrington. Harrington wasn't just any neighbor. He was a living cliché of suburban wealth. Think designer polo shirts, Rolex tan lines, and a yard with perfectly aligned solar garden lights that probably cost more than Emma's last vacation. His teeth were so white, they practically reflected sunlight like a disco ball, and his nails looked more polished than hers after a rare spa day. The man was insufferably perfect. Emma's initial shock turned into disbelief, then irritation, as she muttered, "Why the hell am I paying for this guy's roof? He's probably got a trust fund that regenerates like Wolverine." She called the HOA immediately, fingers jabbing her phone screen with growing frustration. After a few rings, the line clicked, and she was greeted by a voice so monotone it could cure insomnia. HOA Management Office, how can I assist you today? Hi, yeah, I just received an insane letter about a charge. I think there's been a mistake, Emma began, her voice still polite, but with an undercurrent of what the hell is this nonsense. The voice on the other end remained unnervingly composed. Ma'am, could you provide your lot number and details about the letter? She did. There was a pause, just long enough to give her false hope that they might apologize and admit to a clerical error. But instead, the voice returned, cold and indifferent. Ma'am, this is not a mistake. According to the new guidelines adopted last month, you are responsible for contributing to the community's structural improvements, including shared roofing costs, for certain properties in your section of the neighborhood. Emma felt her jaw slacken. I'm sorry, what? Shared roofing costs? That's not my roof. This is ridiculous. You expect me to fork over 18 grand for a house that isn't even mine? That is correct, ma'am, the voice replied, void of any sympathy. These assessments were approved by the HOA board and are legally binding under our current bylaws. She wanted to scream. This couldn't be real. It felt like some dystopian prank. Who in their right mind thought it was reasonable to extort residents like this? Harrington's perfectly smug face flashed in her mind. He was probably lounging under some cabana with a margarita while she was expected to finance his luxury renovation. The absurdity of it all stoked a fire deep in her gut. This wasn't going to fly. Okay, she hissed into the phone, her voice icy. We'll see about that. Emma ended the call, took a deep breath, and stared down at the letter again. If the HOA thought they could bulldoze her with bureaucratic BS, they had another thing coming. She wasn't going to sit back and pay for someone else's vanity project. It was time to start digging. Emma dove headfirst into the HOA's bureaucratic labyrinth, the dense pile of legalese, amendments, and bylaw revisions that most sane people avoided like the plague. It was a special kind of torture, paragraph after paragraph, of mind-numbing jargon designed to confuse and deter. But Emma wasn't about to quit. Somewhere in these cursed documents was the truth behind the absurd roof charge. It didn't take long for something suspicious to surface. Buried in a recent policy update, she found what she was looking for, a newly added clause about communal structural maintenance fees. And who had signed off on this little gem? None other than James Cortland, the HOA chairman. Cortland. That name sounded familiar. Emma's eyes narrowed as she recalled all the smug, over-the-top neighborhood events she'd seen him hosting, and every time, standing right beside him, there was always Harrington. The two seemed inseparable, like a power duo ruling over their suburban kingdom with cocktails in hand. Their photos practically screamed, "We're better than you," capturing exclusive gatherings filled with designer outfits, catered food, and laughter that echoed through meticulously landscaped backyards. Meanwhile, residents like Emma were struggling to keep up with skyrocketing HOA dues. A neighbor 2 houses down had recently mentioned needing a second job just to cover rising fees. Emma had brushed it off at the time, thinking it was just neighborhood gossip, but now the pieces were falling into place. Her mind buzzed with suspicion. Was this all part of some orchestrated scheme? Cortland and Harrington had to be connected somehow. Why else would the HOA enforce a rule that conveniently benefited Harrington first? She continued digging but hit a brick wall. Several documents were suspiciously incomplete. Meeting minutes were missing pages. Financial records had confidential redactions, and some sections looked like they had been deliberately tampered with. The deeper she went, the more the whole operation stank of corruption. This wasn't incompetence. This was a cover-up. Emma decided to turn to the people who might know more, her neighbors. She started knocking on doors, careful not to sound too accusatory right away. After all, this was suburbia, where people preferred polite smiles over conflict. But once she asked the right questions, the floodgates opened. "Oh yeah," said Mr. Thompson, a retired schoolteacher who lived on the corner. "I got billed an extra $10,000 last year for emergency pathway repairs. Never saw any new pathways, though. Just paid it because, well, they threatened to place a lien on my house." Mrs. Alvarez from across the street echoed the sentiment. "They told us if we didn't comply with the assessment for landscaping, we could be fined every month. I couldn't risk it. I have kids to think about." One by one, stories piled up. People had been charged for everything from community security upgrades to fountain restoration projects, none of which ever materialized. They had been scared into silence, afraid that crossing the HOA would mean losing their homes. Emma clenched her fists as anger bubbled inside her. How long had this been going on? How much money had Cortland and Harrington siphoned off under the guise of neighborhood improvements? This wasn't just a bad policy, it was theft. And Emma wasn't about to let them get away with it. Emma wasn't playing around anymore. Armed with a folder full of incriminating evidence, she stormed into the HOA meeting with all the subtlety of a Category 5 hurricane. The usually pristine, over-decorated community center suddenly felt stifling as she entered. Rows of chairs were filled with the so-called important figures of the neighborhood, board members, wealthy homeowners, and, of course, James Cortland, sitting at the head of the table like he was presiding over a royal court. Emma's eyes scanned the room and locked onto Cortland. His face was composed, but she noticed the subtle twitch in his jaw. Harrington sat nearby, pretending not to notice her at all. Typical. He probably thought she'd come to complain quietly and then back down like the rest. Oh, how wrong they were. Emma took a deep breath and stepped forward. All conversation died out as the residents noticed her determined expression, a storm brewing under her calm exterior. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, but carried an undeniable edge of controlled fury. "You thought we wouldn't catch on, didn't you?" Silence. A few people exchanged confused glances, while others leaned forward with growing curiosity. Cortland raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Emma didn't wait for a response. She slammed the folder onto the table, causing a few people to flinch. Fake contracts, inflated charges, kickbacks to shady contractors, and let's not forget the cherry on top. Harrington's nephew owns the contracting company you hired for those urgent repairs. Gasps rippled through the room. All eyes turned to Harrington, who looked as though he had just swallowed a lemon. Cortland tried to maintain his composure, though his face was visibly paler. "Now hold on," Cortland began, his voice forced and condescending. "These are serious accusations. Unless you have concrete proof, I suggest you—" "Oh, I've got proof." Emma cut him off sharply, pulling out pages of records and placing them on the table for everyone to see. Bank transfers, meeting notes, emails, all of it. You and Harrington have been bleeding this community dry under the guise of improvements. You've intimidated residents with legal threats and pushed through policies that only benefit your little clique. The room exploded with murmurs. Cortland's mask of superiority cracked as he frantically scanned the documents in front of him. Emma could see the panic setting in behind his eyes. "This is called fraud," Emma continued, her voice rising with righteous anger. "Congratulations. You almost got away with stealing tens of thousands of dollars from us." One by one, residents began standing up and voicing their outrage. "Is this true? Wait, I paid over $12,000 last year for repairs that never happened. Who's been approving these contracts? We need an audit, immediately." The meeting quickly descended into chaos. People who had previously been too scared to speak out were now shouting demands for transparency and justice. Cortland's attempts to regain control of the situation were drowned out by the uproar. Even his usual allies were turning on him, demanding answers. Emma crossed her arms and watched as the walls of their corrupt little empire began to crumble. This wasn't just about her roof payment anymore. It was about every neighbor who had been bullied, every family who had struggled under the weight of unjust fees. Several board members called for an emergency vote to remove Cortland from his position. Others insisted on reviewing every financial decision made by the HOA in the past year. The once powerful chairman was now nothing more than a cornered rat, scrambling for excuses that no one wanted to hear. As the meeting drew to a close, Emma felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her. The fight wasn't over yet. There would be audits, investigations, and probably legal action. But for now, she had done what she came to do. She had shattered the illusion of untouchability that Cortland and his cronies had carefully built around themselves. Justice, at long last, was coming for them. The anger in the room reached its boiling point. For years, the residents had suffered under the HOA's arbitrary rules and financial extortions, too scared or too exhausted to fight back. But now, with Emma leading the charge, their fear transformed into a righteous fury. The energy was electric as voices rang out in unison, demanding action. "We need a vote. Remove Cortland now. Let's file a formal complaint. Hell, let's file a lawsuit. They've stolen enough from us." The vote was swift and decisive. Cortland was stripped of his position as chairman with an overwhelming majority. The remaining board members, suddenly desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, barely put up any resistance. Harrington, on the other hand, looked like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. His normally polished demeanor had crumbled. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead as he fumbled for an exit strategy. I need to take care of some urgent business," he stammered, edging toward the door like a trapped animal. No one stopped him. Moments later, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a thief fleeing a crime scene. Rumors swirled later that he'd packed up and moved out of the neighborhood entirely. The following weeks were a whirlwind. A collective complaint was filed against the HOA, prompting an official investigation into years of questionable financial practices. Auditors arrived to comb through every contract, every payment, every shady deal that Cortland and his crew had orchestrated. Residents who had once felt powerless now found their voices, emboldened by Emma's defiance. A month later, Emma received another letter from the HOA, but this one was different. No outrageous demands, no threats of legal action. Instead, it was a formal apology from the newly restructured board. They acknowledged the irregularities in past policies and promised full restitution for the illegal charges. Emma couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the sterile corporate language. Irregularities, huh? Sure, let's call it that. Along with the apology came the best news yet. The residents would be refunded every cent they had been wrongfully billed. News of Emma's victory spread quickly through the neighborhood. She became a bit of a local legend, the woman who took on the corrupt HOA and won. Neighbors who had once been mere acquaintances now greeted her warmly on the street. Some stopped by to thank her personally, bringing homemade gifts, pies, cookies, even a casserole or two. "Thank you, Emma," Mrs. Alvarez said one afternoon, handing her a neatly wrapped loaf of banana bread. "You don't know how much this means to us. We were scared for so long, but you stood up for all of us." Emma felt a swell of emotion, but kept her response light. "Well, I couldn't let them get away with it, could I? Besides, I've always wanted to bring down a corrupt HOA. It's a very niche life goal." They both laughed, but the gratitude in Mrs. Alvarez's eyes lingered, warming Emma more than she expected. It was moments like this that made the whole ordeal worthwhile. Later that evening, Emma sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. The battle had been exhausting, but the payoff was worth it. The HOA's grip on the community had been shattered. Sure, there was still work to be done, policies to revise, accountability to enforce, but the worst was behind them. Emma smiled softly to herself. Justice had been served, and for once, it felt like the good guys had won. No one would be using their homes as a personal ATM ever again.